The man who died that morning woke up early because he always did. In Brimstone Flats, Iowa, routines mattered more than intentions. The grain elevator opened at 6. The diner poured its first coffee at 5:30. Men like Arthur Bellamy believed that if you followed the same pattern long enough, nothing unexpected could touch you. At 6:12 a.m., Arthur locked the door of his bungalow, adjusted his hat against the wind, and began the short walk toward County Road 9. He never reached it. By noon, his body would be found in a drainage culvert less than a mile from his home, arranged carefully enough that the deputy on duty would first assume the man had slipped, fallen, and drowned in 6 inches of stagnant water. The death certificate would read accidental asphyxiation. No autopsy, no questions. And no one in Brimstone Flats would remember that morning as the beginning of anything at all. 6 miles away, in a rented house at the edge of town, Caleb Crowder shaved in silence. He was 37 years old, narrow-faced, with a calmness that made people comfortable around him without knowing why. He worked as a regional equipment inspector, an unremarkable job that allowed him to move between counties without drawing attention. He dressed plainly, spoke rarely, and kept his opinions private. In the kitchen behind him, Maribel Crowder sat at the table with a notebook open and untouched coffee cooling beside her hand. Maribel was younger by 5 years and sharper by a lifetime. Her mother had been Cuban, her father an American engineer who disappeared when she was 13. She had learned early that observation was safer than participation. Where Caleb blended, Maribel calculated. "You took the long way," she said without looking up. Caleb rinsed his razor. There was a truck blocking the east access. Maribel nodded once and wrote a single line in her notebook. No dates, no names, just an adjustment. They did not discuss Arthur Bellamy. There was no need. The first rule they shared, unspoken but absolute, was this: nothing mattered until it was finished. Their marriage had begun 4 years earlier in Topeka, Kansas, with a ceremony so small it barely registered as an event. No family attended. No photographs were taken. To outsiders, they were a quiet couple who preferred distance and routine. That was true in a way. Caleb provided access. Maribel provided structure. Neither of them believed in improvisation. The decision to kill had not arrived suddenly or violently. It emerged the way corrosion does, slowly, invisibly, beneath surfaces no one bothered to inspect. Arthur Bellamy had been chosen because he was consistent. He walked the same route. He spoke to the same people. He trusted systems because systems had never failed him. When Caleb introduced himself 2 weeks earlier as a state surveyor needing access to culvert measurements, Arthur had not hesitated. Men like Arthur believed authority wore clean shoes and carried clipboards. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. The death took less than 1. At the county sheriff's office, Deputy Ron Elkins filled out paperwork while eating a sandwich at his desk. The call about the body came in just after 11. By 1:30, the scene had been cleared. "There's nothing there," Elkins said later. "Guy slipped, happens." No one argued. Brimstone Flats had no history of violence worth remembering. The town's crimes were small and personal: fights at bars, unpaid debts, the occasional hunting accident. A middle-aged man drowning on his way to work did not disturb the rhythm. Caleb and Maribel knew this. They had studied places like Brimstone Flats for years. Small towns did not share information. Counties did not coordinate. States did not compare notes. Deaths stayed local, and local deaths faded fast. That afternoon, Maribel washed her hands twice longer than necessary and folded the towel carefully. "One," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. There was no satisfaction in the word, only acknowledgement. Because what they had done was not an act, it was a beginning. If someone had tried to describe the Crowders to the police in 1959, they would have struggled to find the right words. They did not look dangerous. Caleb Crowder was the kind of man people forgot mid-conversation. Medium height, neutral posture, a voice that never rose. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually to confirm what someone else had already said. He dressed like a man who expected to be overlooked. Pressed shirts, muted ties, shoes that never drew the eye. That was not an accident. Caleb had grown up in western Nebraska, the son of a rail maintenance foreman who believed that attention was something to be endured, not sought. As a boy, Caleb learned how to stay quiet in rooms full of louder men. He learned how to be useful without being visible. By adulthood, invisibility had become instinct. His job suited him perfectly. As a regional equipment inspector, he moved between agricultural facilities, water control sites, and county projects. Clipboards opened doors. Forms ended conversations. People assumed legitimacy when it arrived neatly labeled. Marable, on the other hand, was remembered, though rarely described accurately. She had dark hair she kept pinned back and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke with a slight accent that most people could never quite place, and that uncertainty made them lean in, eager to understand her better. She worked part-time as a medical records clerk when they stayed in one place long enough, a position that trained her to see patterns where others saw paperwork. Marable did not believe in coincidence. She believed in repetition. Her childhood had been fragmented: Florida, then Texas, then Ohio, each move following a man who never explained himself and eventually never came back. By 16, she understood that systems failed quietly. Hospitals misplaced files. Schools lost transcripts. Police departments forgot faces once they crossed county lines. Order, she learned, was something you imposed yourself. Their marriage functioned less like a romance and more like a partnership built on efficiency. They did not argue, they did not apologize. Decisions were discussed in the evenings over notebooks and folded maps spread across kitchen tables. Caleb handled logistics, access, timing, routes. Marable handled evaluation, risk, aftermath, adjustment. There was no leader between them, but there was clarity. And clarity, Marable believed, was the rarest form of power. They moved every 12 to 18 months, never abruptly, never dramatically. A job transfer here, a better rental there. Each move erased small accumulations of familiarity before they could harden into recognition. Caleb understood the value of distance. Marable understood the value of endings. Arthur Bellamy's death had been discussed exactly once after it happened. The conversation lasted under 3 minutes. Caleb reported the conditions: weather, visibility, witnesses. Marable reviewed the outcome: response time, classification, paperwork trail. They confirmed that nothing connected back to them. When the checklist was complete, they closed the notebook. They did not dwell on what Arthur had felt. To them, emotion was noise. What mattered was the structure, the fact that a man could be removed from a system and the system would adjust without protest, that a life could end and be absorbed into routine by lunchtime. That was the lesson Arthur provided. And it was not enough. The second target would be different. Marable insisted on that. Variation prevents focus, she said one evening as she marked a map of southern Minnesota. Patterns don't form unless you let them. Caleb considered this. He trusted her instincts, not because they were emotional, but because they were precise. She had an ability to see consequences as shapes, overlapping, drifting toward exposure if left unattended. They needed a death that looked nothing like the first. No water, no early mornings, no public spaces. Something enclosed. Something explainable. Caleb nodded once. "I'll find access," he said. Marable closed the notebook. And somewhere north of Brimstone Flats, a different routine was about to be interrupted, one that would not be dismissed as easily, but still would not be connected. Not yet. The second man died indoors, exactly as Marable wanted. His name was Harlan Weiss, and he managed a privately owned cold storage warehouse outside Mankato, Minnesota. The building held meat, dairy, and grain samples, nothing unusual, nothing closely regulated. It was the kind of place inspectors visited without notice and left without supervision. Caleb had been inside twice before the day Harlan died. The first visit established routine, the second confirmed complacency. Harlan Weiss liked talking to people who carried authority. He was proud of his operation, proud of his efficiency, and careless in the way men became when they believed themselves competent. When Caleb introduced himself as part of a regional safety review, Harlan had walked him through the facility personally, explaining ventilation systems, emergency shutoffs, and refrigeration cycles with unnecessary detail. He never noticed Marable. She waited in the car the first time. The second time, she followed at a distance, clipboard in hand, silent and unremarkable. Harlan assumed she was a trainee. He never asked her name. They learned everything they needed in under 20 minutes. The death occurred on a Thursday afternoon in early March of 1960. A maintenance issue had been reported in one of the auxiliary refrigeration rooms, a compressor running hotter than normal. Caleb arrived first, presenting paperwork that looked official enough to bypass protocol. Harlan followed him inside, still talking. The room was narrow, loud, and cold. The door closed automatically. That was important. The method Marable selected required time, not force. Carbon dioxide buildup from a deliberately misregulated valve, a slow deprivation that left no marks, no signs of struggle. By the time Harlan realized something was wrong, his body had already begun to betray him. Caleb left the room calmly, sealing the door behind him. Marable watched from the hallway, counting seconds by the rhythm of the machinery. When they returned 20 minutes later, Harlan Weiss was seated against the wall, his face slack, his lungs full of air that had never reached oxygen. The scene was reset carefully. The valve was returned to its proper position. The system resumed normal function. When a worker found the body later that evening, the assumption was immediate and reasonable. Malfunction. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as industrial accident resulting from equipment failure. The warehouse was fined. A safety notice was issued. No criminal investigation followed. Caleb and Marable read the newspaper clipping the next morning over breakfast. Marable folded it precisely. Different environment, she said, different explanation. And different jurisdiction, Caleb added. They were learning what could be done. More importantly, they were learning what could be ignored. The third death came 6 months later and further south. By then they had moved again, this time to a quiet rental outside Caruthersville, Missouri, near the river. Caleb's job transfer had been easy. His paperwork was clean. Marable found part-time work at a small clinic, filing patient records and learning how easily medical histories fragmented across counties. The third victim was a woman named Evelyn Cross, a traveling seamstress who rented rooms by the week. She lived alone, she drank alone, she trusted strangers who spoke gently. Marable met her first. They spoke twice before the night Evelyn died, once about fabric, once about men. Marable listened, nodded, and catalogued the woman's habits with clinical interest. The method, this time, involved medication. Not poison, not violence, just dosage. Evelyn's death was ruled cardiac failure exacerbated by alcohol. The pills found in her room were prescribed, legal, and common. No one questioned how many she had taken or why. By the time the report was filed, Caleb and Marable were already planning their next move. 3 deaths, 3 explanations, 3 different states, and still nothing connected them. Not the names, not the methods, not the faces. What they did not yet understand was that variation could delay recognition, but it could not erase it forever. Somewhere, eventually, repetition would form. And when it did, it would not be obvious at first. By the time the fourth death occurred, Caleb and Marable had learned something essential about themselves. They were not reckless. And because they were not reckless, they began to believe they were careful enough to improve. The move to Hutchinson, Kansas, in late 1961 felt temporary even as it settled into routine. The town was small, efficient, and proud of its order. People locked their doors out of habit rather than fear. The local police department consisted of a chief, 2 deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who went home before dusk. It was the kind of place where conclusions came easily. Marable liked that. Their next victim would not be chosen for access or convenience. This time, Marable wanted interaction, a death that required engagement, trust, and time. She chose Leonard Pike, a door-to-door insurance adjuster who visited rural homes across 3 counties. He was 39, unmarried, and unfailingly polite. He kept records obsessively, carried cash, and believed paperwork protected him from unpredictability. Caleb met Leonard first. He posed as a property owner with minor storm damage, invited Leonard inside, and allowed him to talk uninterrupted for nearly 40 minutes. Men like Leonard filled silence to reassure themselves. They explained process. They documented control. That was the opening. The murder did not happen that day. It happened a week later, after trust had been established and routine normalized. Leonard returned with revised forms. He accepted coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and set his briefcase at his feet. The toxin Marable selected was not exotic. It was common, legal, and slow, something that mimicked a natural failure if administered carefully. Leonard collapsed before he finished his second cup. The scene was arranged to suggest stress. Long hours, poor health, no signs of struggle. The coroner ruled it a sudden medical event. Another file closed without ceremony. But this time, something lingered. Leonard Pike's roots overlapped counties. His death was noted by more than one office. A deputy in Reno County mentioned it in passing to a colleague in McPherson County. Nothing formal, just curiosity. The 5th death came too soon. That was Marable's decision, and it was the first time Caleb hesitated. Spacing mattered, distance mattered, rhythm mattered. But Marable had begun to feel constrained by caution. 5 years had passed since Arthur Bellamy. 4 deaths had disappeared into paperwork and habit. The system had proven itself malleable. She wanted to test it. The 5th victim was Nora Feld, a retired school teacher living alone in a farmhouse outside town. She volunteered, attended church, and kept meticulous journals. Her death would not be hidden by chaos, but by sympathy. Marable visited her twice under the pretense of organizing donation records. She learned Nora's medications, her schedule, her loneliness. The method was subtle, the outcome predictable. Nora Feld died in her sleep. The town mourned, the church filled, stories were shared. No one asked how a woman with stable health had declined so quickly. Except one person. Sheriff Harold Kincaid had been in law enforcement long enough to distrust coincidences that presented themselves too neatly. He reviewed Nora's file late one evening and paused over a detail most would ignore: the prescription refill dates. They didn't align. It was not enough for suspicion, not even close. But it was enough to make him file the name away. Crowder was not written anywhere. Not yet. Still, something had shifted. For the first time, a death had not simply vanished into routine. It had left a faint disturbance, like a ripple that did not immediately settle. Caleb felt it before Marable admitted it. "Next time," he said quietly that night, "we slow down." Marable did not argue, but she did not write anything down either. And that omission would matter. The 6th death was supposed to restore balance. After Nora Feld, Marable agreed to wait. 3 months passed, then 4. Caleb took assignments farther afield, crossing into southern Illinois, where towns thinned out and records grew less precise. The space eased the tension between them, or at least disguised it. They settled briefly near Cairo, Illinois, at the edge of the river, where freight traffic passed through and strangers were expected. The victim was chosen carefully. Thomas Riley, 46, worked nights as a signal technician for the rail yard. He lived alone in a company-owned duplex and drank predictably after his shifts. His job gave him access to restricted areas, his habits made him vulnerable, and his employer was known for minimizing incidents that delayed operations. Caleb introduced himself as a safety auditor, responding to complaints about faulty signaling. Thomas was flattered to be consulted. He liked feeling useful. The plan was simple. An electrical fault staged to appear accidental, a fall, contact, death. It worked. Thomas Riley was found beside an open junction box, burns on his hands consistent with workplace injury. The rail company's internal report was brief. The county coroner deferred to it. Another closed file. Except this time, Marable kept something. It was small, a pair of leather-work gloves Thomas had left on a chair near the door. She took them without discussion, folded them neatly, and placed them in a storage box beneath the spare room floorboard. Caleb noticed. "We don't keep anything," he said later. Marable's response was calm. "They're not identifiable." "That's not the point." But she had already moved on. To her, the gloves were not trophies. They were proof of method, of control, of completion. Evidence only mattered if someone looked for it. And no one was looking. Sheriff Harold Kincaid received the rail yard report 2 weeks later through a routine inter-county bulletin. He read it once, then again. The language was familiar, too familiar. Equipment failure, employee error, no criminal indicators. He set it beside 3 other files on his desk. Different states, different victims, different causes. But the timing felt wrong. Men and women dying quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. No violence, no struggle, no urgency in the aftermath. Kincaid did not think serial killer. Not yet. That was a word for cities, for spectacle. What he thought instead was process. Someone was choosing deaths that fit into systems already designed to explain them away. He began making phone calls. Not official ones, not recorded ones, conversations framed as professional curiosity. He asked coroners how often they skipped autopsies, asked deputies how often inspectors came through unannounced. Patterns emerged, not cleanly, not conclusively, but enough to disturb his sleep. The Crowders sensed the change before they could name it. Caleb noticed a state trooper watching too long at a fuel stop. Marable overheard a nurse mention a quiet inquiry about prescription logs from years earlier. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory, just attention. The mistake, Caleb realized, had not been the 6th death. It had been the assumption that silence meant invisibility. Marable returned to the storage box that night and stared at the gloves longer than necessary. For the first time in years, she hesitated. And hesitation, unlike violence, left a trace. Somewhere between Illinois and Kansas, Sheriff Kincaid added a new note to his growing file. Possibility of 2 offenders, shared access, domestic proximity. It was still a theory, but it was no longer nothing. Sheriff Harold Kincaid did not announce an investigation. He understood the limits of his authority too well for that. Counties guarded their autonomy. States protected their statistics. Declaring a multi-state pattern without evidence would have ended his career quietly and efficiently. So he worked the way the Crowders did, patiently, without attention. He started by building timelines. Not causes of death, not victim profiles, just dates, locations, and the bureaucratic aftermath, when reports were filed, when bodies were released, when files were closed. He noticed how often the phrase, "no further action required," appeared, and how quickly. Speed, Kincaid believed, was its own kind of evidence. The deaths shared no signature, no obvious method, but they shared something subtler. Each victim occupied a position within a system that preferred resolution over scrutiny: industrial oversight, medical care, insurance, infrastructure. People who were expected to die quietly if something went wrong. By late 1964, Kincaid had assembled 7 files on his desk. He did not label them as murders. He labeled them as exceptions. Caleb and Marable moved again, this time to northern Arkansas, to a town small enough that new faces were still noticed, but only briefly. Caleb's job continued to provide cover. Marable found work at a county medical office, where she handled intake forms and learned how easily paperwork crossed state lines without anyone following it. They adjusted their behavior. No more short intervals, no more local victims. They limited exposure, avoided hospitals, avoided anything that could be re-examined. The 7th death occurred in early 1966. Walter Hume, a traveling agricultural consultant, collapsed alone in a motel room after an evening of drinking and paperwork. The desk clerk found him the next morning. The police report cited heart failure. The motel cleaned the room by noon. Marable watched the obituary appear 3 days later. "Claim," she said. Caleb did not answer. He had noticed something else. A car parked across the street from their rental the week before. A question asked twice at a gas station by 2 different men in uniform. Not surveillance, not yet, but interest. Interest was dangerous. Kincaid's breakthrough did not come from evidence. It came from absence. One victim's personal effects had never been returned to next of kin. Another's medication list was incomplete. A third had no recorded employer interview despite standard procedure. These were not mistakes made by criminals. They were omissions made by people who assumed someone else had checked. Kincaid requested copies of archived evidence logs from 3 states under the pretense of a training review. Most offices complied. One did not. Illinois. A storage clerk reported a missing entry from 1963. A pair of work gloves logged in but never released. Kincaid felt the shift immediately. Objects stayed. Accidents did not keep souvenirs. The Crowders were no longer invisible. They felt it in the way conversations ended faster, in how officials verified credentials instead of waving them through, in how Marable's access to records narrowed without explanation. Caleb began revising routes nightly. He memorized exits, alternates, margins. Marable stopped writing in the notebook. Instead, she began rehearsing answers. The 8th death was planned and then cancelled. For the first time since Arthur Bellamy, they chose not to act. That decision unsettled them more than any investigation, because it meant they were reacting, and reaction implied pursuit. Sheriff Kincaid assembled a quiet task group in early 1967, 2 deputies and 1 state investigator who knew how to keep his mouth shut. They did not have a suspect, but they had a theory. 2 people married or closely linked, mobile, professionally legitimate. And somewhere, they believed, there was a box that had never been meant to exist. The hunt did not accelerate. It narrowed, and the Crowders were running out of room to adjust. The search for the Crowders did not begin with their names. It began with an address that no longer mattered. Sheriff Kincaid's team traced the missing gloves to a temporary rental outside Cairo, Illinois, a house that had already been occupied by 2 different families since the Riley case. The current tenants knew nothing. The landlord remembered little. Paperwork had been filed, taxes paid, nothing unusual reported. But Kincaid had learned to distrust clean stories. He requested permission to inspect the property under the pretense of a structural safety review. The state investigator handled the request. It was approved without resistance. The discovery came late in the afternoon. A deputy noticed a section of flooring in the spare room that sounded wrong when tapped, slightly hollow, slightly newer than the rest. They lifted it carefully. The box beneath was small, sealed, and deliberate. Inside were the gloves. Also inside, a folded motel receipt from Arkansas, a handwritten list of highway exits, and a pharmacy label with a woman's name scratched out but not fully erased. It was not enough for an arrest. It was enough for certainty. The gloves were traced back to Thomas Riley within hours. His widow identified them immediately. The receipt placed someone connected to his death hundreds of miles away within a year of 2 other unexplained fatalities. The pharmacy label came from Missouri. For the first time, the deaths spoke to each other clearly. Kincaid issued a quiet alert, not an APB, not a bulletin. A request for records involving a man named Caleb Crowder, whose inspection credentials appeared in 3 separate counties over 9 years. The response was immediate. Too immediate. Caleb's employment history was impeccable. His transfers aligned perfectly with each region's unexplained deaths. His references were real, his licenses valid. But the pattern held. And patterns, once named, refused to disappear. The Crowders noticed the shift the same day. Caleb's employer requested additional verification documents he had already submitted twice. A deputy appeared at Marable's office asking about old prescription logs for a training exercise. Marable answered calmly, too calmly. That night, she retrieved the box from beneath the floor in their current rental and stared at its contents for a long time. "We should have destroyed it," Caleb said. Marable closed the lid. "It didn't matter before. It matters now." She did not disagree. Surveillance began 2 weeks later. Unmarked cars, men who did not look directly at them, phone calls that clicked when answered. Caleb mapped the routes and concluded what Kincaid already knew. They were done moving. The arrest came quietly on a Tuesday morning in May 1967. No weapons drawn, no resistance offered. Caleb was stopped during a routine traffic check. Marable was taken from her desk at the county office. They were transporting separately, questioned separately, and held without explanation for 6 hours. When the charges were read, neither of them reacted. Conspiracy, multiple counts, interstate homicide. Marable asked one question: "How many?" The investigator did not answer, because they were still counting. And the evidence, now that it had a place to belong, was only beginning to surface. The Crowders' rental house did not look like a crime scene. That was the first thing Sheriff Kincaid noticed when he stepped through the doorway. No overturned furniture, no locked rooms, no smell of panic. The place felt paused, as though its occupants might return at any moment and continue living exactly as before. That, Kincaid understood, was the most disturbing part. 2 deputies moved room to room while a state investigator photographed everything. The search warrant was broad: financial records, travel documentation, personal effects. No one expected drama. They found structure instead. In the bedroom, clothing hung neatly pressed, shoes aligned, receipts stacked by month. In the kitchen, cupboards labeled on the inside doors, a calendar marked only with initials and fuel stops. Marable's handwriting. In the spare room, beneath a loose floorboard identical to the one in Illinois, they found the second box. This one was heavier. Inside were items that should never have existed together. A man's wristwatch, identified later as Harlan Weiss. A motel key tag from Caruthersville, Missouri. 2 prescription bottles with altered labels. And a bundle of women's fabric swatches tied with twine. The swatches belonged to Evelyn Cross. The weight of the case shifted immediately. The garage provided the rest. A trunk wrapped in oilcloth, soil still clinging to its seams. Inside, wrapped in butcher paper, were bones, small, deliberate fragments. A forensic anthropologist would later confirm they belonged to Nora Feld. The rest of her body had never been recovered. Caleb and Marable had not kept trophies out of sentiment. They had kept proof. Proof that the system could be navigated, that deaths could be engineered, that endings could be catalogued. The interrogations revealed the difference between them. Caleb sat still, hands folded, answering questions narrowly. He admitted nothing. He denied nothing. His voice remained level, his gaze fixed somewhere past the detective's shoulder. Marable leaned forward. She corrected timelines. She clarified dates. She pointed out procedural errors. When confronted with evidence, she did not protest, she evaluated. "Your husband planned the access," the investigator said. Marable tilted her head. "Access is not motive." "Then what was?" She paused, considering. "Completion." The word settled in the room like dust. News traveled slowly at first. Local papers reported an arrest connected to a series of suspicious deaths. By the following week, wire services began to connect the dots. Counties reviewed old files. Coroners reopened reports. Families asked questions that had been buried beneath condolence and time. 7 deaths became 8. 8 became 9. Some would never be fully proven, others would. Caleb and Marable were formally charged in 3 states. Extradition requests stacked. The federal government declined involvement. This was not spectacle, not politics, just bureaucracy finally catching up with intention. The trial would be held in Kansas. It would take nearly 2 years to begin. In that time, the Crowders did not speak to each other. They did not need to. Everything that had once existed between them now sat labeled in evidence lockers, neatly catalogued, no longer theirs to organize. And for the first time since Arthur Bellamy stepped into the cold Iowa morning, their system no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the state. The trial of Caleb and Marable Crowder began in October of 1969 in Sedgwick County, Kansas. There were no crowds outside the courthouse, no shouting, no cameras flashing in their faces. This was not the kind of case that fed on outrage. It was quiet, procedural, and heavy, like everything the Crowders had done. The prosecution avoided drama on purpose. They understood that emotion would only confuse what was already difficult to explain. How 2 ordinary people had killed repeatedly without violence, without witnesses, and without urgency. Instead, they presented structure. The first week was devoted entirely to timelines. Jurors were shown maps marked with pins, different colors for different states. Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Kansas, Illinois, Arkansas. Dates were read aloud. Transfers, rentals, job assignments, medical access logs. Individually, each death looked complete. Together, they formed a corridor. An expert from the state crime lab testified about the boxes, about how the gloves, fabric swatches, medication bottles, and bone fragments established continuity of control. These were not souvenirs, he explained. They were records. "Who keeps records of accidents?" the prosecutor asked. "No one," the expert replied. Families testified next. Not to accuse, but to identify. A widow recognized her husband's watch. A sister identified handwriting on a motel receipt. A former co-worker described how a man like Caleb would never have been questioned when he asked for access. The jury listened in silence. Caleb did not react. Marable took notes. The defense attempted separation. They argued Caleb was a passive participant, a man manipulated by a dominant spouse. They argued Marable never physically harmed anyone and that possession of objects did not prove causation. The strategy failed slowly. too slowly to notice at first, until Marable took the stand. She had insisted, against counsel's advice, against logic. Her testimony lasted 3 hours. She spoke clearly, without hesitation. She explained logistics. She explained timing. She explained why some deaths worked and others required adjustment. She never used the word murder. She referred to each event as an outcome. When the prosecutor asked whether she felt remorse, Marable paused, not theatrically but thoughtfully. "Remorse requires surprise," she said. There was none. The courtroom did not react. That was worse. Caleb declined to testify. In his closing statement, his attorney described him as a man who followed where he was led, a technician, a facilitator, a husband who trusted too much. The prosecution responded with a single sentence: "Trust does not build boxes under floorboards." Deliberation took 11 hours. The verdicts were unanimous. Guilty on all counts that could be legally proven: conspiracy, interstate homicide, obstruction, unlawful possession of human remains. The sentencing phase was brief. Kansas law was clear. The judge read the decision without inflection: death by lethal injection. Caleb closed his eyes. Marable wrote nothing. The partnership that had once functioned with such precision ended not with collapse, but with administration. And that, perhaps, was the most fitting end possible. Only one thing remained: the execution. And what, if anything, they would leave behind. The executions were scheduled 4 months apart. Not for mercy, for logistics. Kansas State Penitentiary had learned, quietly, that Caleb and Marable Crowder were never to be moved on the same day, never housed on the same wing, never allowed even the illusion of proximity. The state did not want a final gesture. No notes passed through guards, no shared looks across corridors. Whatever they had been together, it would not be completed as a pair. Caleb was first. In the weeks leading up to his execution, he spoke little. He refused spiritual counsel. He declined letters. When asked if he wished to make a statement, he said only, "I did what I was good at." On the morning of April 3, 1970, he ate breakfast without comment: eggs, toast, black coffee. Witnesses later said he appeared relieved, not frightened, not resigned, but finished, as though the removal of decision itself had become a comfort. When the injection was administered, Caleb Crowder died in under 6 minutes. There were no last words worth recording. Marable's execution followed in August. Unlike Caleb, she requested a final meeting with a court-appointed psychiatrist. The session lasted 90 minutes. No transcript was released, but the psychiatrist later resigned his position and never testified again in a capital case. Marable requested no religious rites. Her final statement was brief. "You will misremember this," she said. "You always do." At 12:41 a.m., the injection began. At 12:48 a.m., Marable Crowder was pronounced dead. The aftermath did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A county clerk in Iowa reopened Arthur Bellamy's file and found inconsistencies he had never noticed before. A retired coroner in Minnesota admitted, off record, that he had felt pressured to simplify. A motel owner in Missouri recognized a photograph and realized he had checked the Crowders in under false names. No new charges were filed. No new trials held. The system does not revisit what it has already buried. The Crowder house was demolished the following year. The land was sold, then resold. A new family moved in. Children played in the yard where investigators once stood smoking in silence. No marker was placed, no plaque, no warning. The boxes were destroyed after appeals were exhausted. Evidence, once useful, becomes liability. In the end, the Crowders did not change procedure. They did not force reform. They did not become myths. They existed briefly as a case study, a demonstration of how harm does not always announce itself with chaos or blood. Sometimes it arrives with schedules, with paperwork, with people who understand how systems breathe and how they can be made to stop. Arthur Bellamy's name appears now in a footnote. So do the others. Caleb and Marable Crowder are listed only once, at the bottom of a state archive ledger in faded ink. Sentence carried out, case closed. And that is how their story ends. Not with horror, but with order.